Former CNN executive and media critic Steve Krakaeur is out with a new book, Uncovered: How the Media Got Cozy with Power, Abandoned Its Principles, and Lost the People. A great title. According to Steve, the Fourth Estate is supposed to be a conduit to the people and a check on power. Instead, we have a bunch of geographically isolated, introspection-free, cozy with power, egomaniacal journalists thirsty for elite approval. Steve Krakaeur joins us now to expand on his writing. Welcome to Rising, Steve.
Hey, great to be back with you guys.
Yeah, great to have you. Tell us a little bit more about what the book gets into.
Yeah, I've really tried to position Uncovered as a non-ideological look at the problems in the media over the last 5 to 7 years. I'm not a particularly ideological person either. Someone who worked at CNN, as you mentioned. It's changed a lot it really just within years after I left. But I don't want to destroy the media. I like independent media upstarts, and I like a strong institutional press. But right now, we have a press that is distrusted for good reason by the large majority of the country, not just the right, but independents and even the left as well. So I've diagnosed what I believe are 5 large problems with the press, from coziness with power, geographic bias, Twitter loosely, and try to find some solutions, because I do think that we need a press that is trusted by the media, by the public, and we don't have that right now, and that's really a disservice to the audience.
Well, let's dig into these 5 kind of motives, problems here that you've identified. The coastal bias, I think, is obvious to explain. The idea that journalists are all too online and have a disproportionate sense of the issues that matter, the stories that matter to people, and kind of just talking about each other a lot. I think that's easy to understand. But one critique that we've made quite a bit here, and that a lot of leftists have made of liberal media, so there isn't real ideological diversity there, that there's this kind of never Trump Republican that's not really reflected in the mainstream media. There are these sanitized versions of the left who aren't really reflecting what real leftists think. And so there's basically no one on the TV screen that's representing anybody's politics, much less the geographical center of the country. And I wonder if you can speak to that, and whether you have any insights as a former insider of how these booking decisions get made, if there's ever any conversation about trying to mimic some of the energy that's happening on the online media sphere. Do people even know that that's a problem that people outside corporate media have identified?
100%. I think this is a huge problem, and I think it manifests in 2 ways. I'll give you, first of all, I think that it does speak to that geographic bias, I think, because most of the country, the political opinions, the policy opinions of the average citizen are messy, are complicated. They are not neatly fit into what you see from pundits yelling at each other on cable news. And there's a reason for that. It's because who populates the green rooms of these establishment media organizations are people, as you mentioned, that doesn't matter really what party they are. They're all roughly the general blandness, sameness of just this corporate establishment, the sort of consensus opinion out there. Totally boring and predictable. So I do think that's a big problem. And I will say, as they lose the power, they feel that power slipping beneath their feet, thanks to places like YouTube, thanks to places like Substack and podcasts. They are actually starting to try to have the pendulum swing in the other direction, because they can really feel the power that they're losing. But I also do think it manifests in another way, because in Chapter 8, I get into what happened with Bernie Sanders in 2020, which I think that Bernie Sanders was sort of screwed over in 2016 by the political establishment. But in 2020, it was as much the media from the left, MSNBC, CNN to a lesser extent, that galvanized behind Joe Biden when it really seemed after Nevada like Bernie Sanders was the clear front runner to the nomination. They got behind it, and everyone, people that are sort of liberal darlings, Joy Reid from MSNBC, I document in the book, they went and they turned against Bernie Sanders and his supporters. That's coming from the left media. So it's not easy to just dismiss all of what's wrong with the press as a political bias towards, against Republicans. It's much more complicated than that, and it's deeper. And I do think it really boils down to institutional power that they're trying to cling on to.
I read in Mediaite just the other day a report that was based on, I think, some new information in your book about the, quote, Maoist struggle session that took place in the New York Times over the former editorial page editor running the infamous Tom Cotton op-ed about sending in the National Guard or whoever it was. Can you share some of your reporting on that episode with our audience?
Yeah, this was a really alarming one. I remember in June of 2020 when this happened, feeling like this was a real inflection point. This is something fundamental had shifted there, and that's why in Chapter 10 I spend so much time on it. And I will mention, the Mediaite and some of the other places that have picked up on this. Everyone is on the record in the book. There's no anonymous sources. So this was a former New York Times employee, an opinion writer, who's now at New York Magazine, who shared in very deep detail exactly what was going on internally at the New York Times. We got to see what played out externally on Twitter, the way that in New York Times staffers galvanized other activists on Twitter to force out an opinion editor for daring to run a column by a United States senator. Now, you can disagree with the column. You can say it's a terrible column, this is horrible, but to push out, to actually get the New York Times executives to take this sort of extreme action, that's alarming. And then the other side of what we see is this idea that I get that activists might be mad about the New York Times running this op-ed, but journalists, there should be the ones who are for free expression, for free speech, for an exchange of ideas, and especially journalists at the New York Times. Instead, we saw what are supposedly, objective, fair journalists pushing back at the idea of even running speech, even running a column from a United States senator. That was really alarming, and I do think that was a real moment where we step back and say, this is where the media is right now. This is who populates these newsrooms right now, and that's a problem for the public.
Yeah, we're seeing this play out right now with the New York Times with the controversy on the letters objecting to the coverage of trans issues, and then the subsequent publishing of an article in defense of J.K. Rowling, who has been a critic of some of these issues. And then the New York Times Union basically being torn between is its role to protect the kind of the employment interests of reporters who have a right and investment in freedom and reporting on things like a defense of J.K. Rowling, or these other reporters who, yes, are using kind of Twitter outrage and activist groups that are explicitly have an agenda, which they're of course allowed to have, like GLAAD, right, to leverage editorial decisions that they would prefer to be made, and it's an ongoing and very difficult issue. And I'm glad that you get into that somewhat in your book. I got to ask you, just from a basic kind of market financial perspective, it's always been very curious to me that if you have an insurgent rise of something in politics, like the Bernie Sanders movement, a left movement, an obvious interest by about 30% of the country in a different kind of politics. The same way that you had this insurgent Trump interest in Donald Trump, and you had, there's an interest in reporting on rural communities and going to different parts of America, and a lot of reporting on what motivates a Trump voter that we saw back in 2016. It doesn't seem like there is a business response from a lot of these institutions to say, okay, let's just get one DSA member on the panel. Let's get one Green Party. Let's get one socialist from New York. Let's get Jabari Brisport on a panel occasionally, just because we know it'll get people to tune in and we can sell ad dollars. Just even on that simple business metric, it seems like a decision is being made that something is motivating them other than the market. Something is motivating them to never try to have an actual Trump supporter instead of a never Trump supporter, or an actual leftist audit instead of a kind of Sam Bankman-Fried orbit type of person who could just talk about effective altruism or something like that. What's going on there?
I think that there are several factors, but I do think that in general, large, giant media organizations are like tankers. It takes them a while to make a turn, and for a very long time, until fairly recently, the business model of places like a CNN, or I write about ESPN in the book as another example of this, they were pretty solid, and then suddenly things have shifted rapidly, and now it's like, well, what are we going to do now? Now we have to actually do something about it. So I do think that maybe the financial incentives, for a very long time, they just were very complacent in their business model. Well, now that business model has fundamentally changed. Now they're going to get panicked, and if they were smart, they would make those sorts of shifts, because I do think that there is 100% a market for it. Now, the other factor of this is the incentive structure. You've got the loudest voices on Twitter, and listen, I spent a lot of time on Twitter, too much. I wish I didn't, but I know the feeling of when a few hundred people are praising you. It just can feel like a drug. And when 50 people start yelling at you, it can really feel like the walls are closing in. Now, imagine that in newsrooms. And I speak to Sharon Waxman, for example, of The Wrap, who describes her own reporters moving away from stories or covering stories differently or not covering them at all because of the reaction they get or they might get from Twitter. So that's a huge problem. You have places that are making business decisions based on the cultural pushback that they might get from places like Twitter. That's a real problem. And we need strong executives, strong institutional journalists to say, we don't care about that. We need to serve the audience and not serve the loudest voices on social media.
One last thing, I just wanted to ask you, we were remiss not to ask about this emerging story about these communications that have come out in the wake of this Dominion libel lawsuit that show that some Fox News reporters seem to have had a kind of a public opinion and a private opinion about some of their own guests, not really finding them to be credible, having them on anyway. And then when some other Fox reporters were publicly pushing back against how some of the Fox News reporting was characterized, basically pushing back against election denialism, there was Tucker Carlson, there was a message, an email showing that he called for the other Fox reporter to be fired because it hurt their brand to be coming out as so kind of publicly and aggressively anti-Trump. You know, where do you put that kind of thing in the context of the public distrust of the media? And do you think that there is any fallout? Will there be any fallout for the Fox viewer who might be confused about why there is this kind of public-private positioning happening there?
I think it's interesting. I think anytime you start to read the text messages of very powerful people, it's a juicy story. And I get that 100%. I do think that what's interesting about that story is that the Dominion lawsuit itself was so much about people like Lou Dobbs or even Jeanine Pirro. And, you know, hundreds of their their social media posts were put out there as the basis for their lawsuit. Well, Lou Dobbs was fired by Fox as a result of this lawsuit. The people that you see the text messages from, Tucker Carlson, Sean Hannity, Laura Ingraham, yes, they may have had some of these guests on, but they were not the loudest voices saying this is a legitimate story either. Now, there is a bias of omission, which I think is very real, is why do you not say what you're maybe saying behind the scenes? But I think that also gets to another factor here, which is that I do think that Trump was leading this charge and was spinning his own people, his own supporters. And Fox, there is a business incentive to say, look, we can't, these people really care about this. These people really believe it. And we have to tread lightly with it. We can't just say that Sidney Powell, the Kraken, is legitimate, but we can't just sit there and just call her out and say that she's a fraud. Although I will say Tucker Carlson did do that on November 19th. So I think it was a very touchy spot. This was a moment right after that 2020 election that it was really perilous for a place like Fox, and they were able to sustain, they were able to survive. I don't think this will hurt them, but I do think it's absolutely interesting, and it is telling. And we need a transparent press, and this is just another example of the lots of complicated decisions that have to go into what you see on the air, what you see in print.
Steve Krakaeur, thank you so much for joining us. The book is Uncovered: How the Media Got Cozy with Power, Abandoned Its Principles, and Lost the People.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks so much for joining us.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
More Rising right after this.